I appreciate the invitation. Thank you for being here. The title of my talk this evening is There is no pathway to peace and security that does not begin with women. And you all have enough collective experience in this room to say, yes, that's true. Thank you very much, and we're done, right? But let me tell you, that is actually a much harder argument to make in certain circles than you would think, all around the world and even here in our own country. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about tonight. Just a little background on me. I am a political scientist through and through. All my training is in political science, but I've always been drawn to interdisciplinary spaces. So that means spaces like human rights, women and gender studies, international studies, these places where multiple perspectives are needed. And I have also experience in law. I also have the great privilege of serving as the executive director at the Human Rights Center. The Human Rights Center supports our undergraduate degree program, which Myron told you about. And it is a remarkable center that I have a great privilege of being a part of. And we do work both in Dayton and on our campus, but around the world. I'm also a women's rights activist, a feminist, unapologetically, a scholar, researcher, author, teacher, educator, and a UD alum. As a picture of me over at the UN, I've spent a lot of time in and around the United Nations doing research. When I was in Connecticut, I took the train many a days into the city to observe meetings and conduct interviews and learn about the practices happening there at UN headquarters. So that's a little bit about me. Just so you know about the Human Rights Center, we were established after the undergraduate degree program was set up in 2008. So the center came on in 2013, and we are an interdisciplinary hub, which means we work with all folks on campus: teacher education, engineers, business, historians, psychologists, political scientists, to think about how to make the world a place that respects human dignity and the basic rights of people. We work at the local level. Dayton is committed to becoming a human rights city. We actually have a big meeting next Wednesday at the City Commission's meeting. We work with the county. We work in DC, and we have students currently doing all sorts of fellowships around the world. And much of this, all of this, is rooted in our mission at the university as a Catholic and Marianist institution. And doing human rights today in the current political climate is not an easy thing, but in fact, our mission has protected our work in really important ways because the commitment to human dignity is deeply embedded in Catholic social teaching. And so it's something that we hold on tight to, particularly in this moment. So the things that we do generational renewal. So we do education, students and alum. We educate students in our human rights studies program, but also in other majors. We are committed to partnerships that bridge global divides. So we have a lot of partners in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia that we work with on research, on providing experiences to students abroad, and service opportunities. And we innovate around transformational advocacy methods, meaning when we do human rights work, we work with those most affected by rights abuses, right? So we work alongside those who are the most affected communities. And so that's what we do at the Human Rights Center. Here's just a couple pictures of our students. We have students right now in Ghana and Gambia and Laos doing really innovative human rights work, from demining in Laos, so working on efforts to demine the Laos community from bombs that were laid during the Vietnam War, to students working on girls' empowerment in rural Kenya, to legal research happening in the Gambia. And these are some of our pictures there. We partner with organizations like the Peace Museum. Abolition Ohio is one of our key initiatives, so anti-trafficking work is another thing that we do here, particularly in the region of Ohio. And so it gives you a sense of the kind of work we do around advocacy. Storytelling is a big part of that, internships, and taking international law, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today, and bringing it down for local impact. So here's what I want to do. I want to tell you a little bit about the opportunity I had to address NATO. Why did they ask me to address their Security and Defense Committee? So I'm going to talk about that. And then in order to really understand what I brought to the table in that presentation, I need to tell you about the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. And so we'll dive into what that is and how it works in the world and how it works in NATO. We'll look at the research that looks at women's participation and protection in armed conflict, the role of civil society, and the opportunity that NATO has to provide leadership in the years to come, and sort of where the US stands in all of this. All right, so NATO came to Dayton, Ohio about a year ago now for the Parliamentary Assembly. And the Parliamentary Assembly is an opportunity for representatives from each NATO country to meet on a regular basis so they can socialize, frankly, so they can have regular interactions, because the more we interact with people, the easier it is to cooperate, the easier it is to find solutions and get along. And they know that. And so twice a year, the Parliamentary Assembly meets. And for the first time in 20 plus years, it was held here in Dayton, of course, on the anniversary of the Dayton Peace Accords. I had the opportunity at the Schuster Center to speak to one of the 5 policy committees, the Committee on Democracy and Security. And that committee, which is made up of all NATO member states, so representatives from all countries in NATO, are focused on facilitating transatlantic dialogue and diplomacy, democratic oversight of their work, and policy influence. So we talked about women, peace, and security, but we also talked about counterterrorism was part of that discussion. And so the NATO Parliamentary Assembly was founded for these very reasons. They've been doing this since 1955. And they also bring in representatives from the European Union to be part of these assemblies. They debate, they discuss, and they try to build consensus around NATO practices. And there was a lot of conversation when I was there around the future of the US in NATO and whether or not at that time, there was a lot of conversation coming out of the administration that maybe we would pull out of NATO. And that has sort of died down, that emphasis. Ukraine was also a big topic of conversation in that committee. And so talking about strategies and efforts in those communities and on those issues was part of the work. So here's the connection between NATO and my research, all right? NATO has recognized that the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, which just hold on to that for a minute, I'm going to tell you what that is. They have recognized that this agenda is really important to what they do. If their goal is to provide collective security to the region of Europe and North America, that agenda, this Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, is really important. They've adopted a lot of policies and concept notes and agendas around implementing these practices. And so they recognize that conflict, war, and tensions, armed tensions, have a disproportionate effect on women and girls. That's not to say that men don't suffer in conflict. They certainly do. It's to say they suffer differently, and we need to understand those differences. I'll talk about that. They recognize the vital roles that women play in peace negotiations and peace processes. And so they've developed quite a bit of architecture, quite a bit of work around how do they do women, peace, and security in NATO. And so my research is on women, peace, and security. And so they asked me to come and talk about some of the most recent research, my own and others, about what's working in this space and what's not and how they could do it better. So I was brought in to talk about the ways I have traditionally studied women, peace, and security in the UN, and I've done a little bit in the EU. And so I was able to take what I did in those spaces and apply it to this NATO context because it's another international organization. This was the goal of my presentation. All right, so before I talk about that research, I want to tell you a little bit more about the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, what that is, and the questions that drive my research. So like the fundamental questions that I'm asking when I interview people, when I study, when I do a focus group, when I analyze a law or a text, what am I really interested in? And the questions that have driven me for 20 years in this space, so I started researching this work when I started grad school in 2001, so it's almost 25 years. The questions that drive me are questions about how does security work in an international space, right? When we say we want to maintain international peace and security, what does that really mean? Whose security are we talking about? Who gets to be secure? And what are we securing against? What is the threat? And in what ways have, my questions then dive into the ways in which women have been able to challenge our notions of security, of what counts as security, what counts as insecurity, and the ways in which we might consider women's rights as security issues. So I'll talk about that. My research then really unpacked what I call the security framework around the idea that women in and around the UN and now NATO and the EU will make, and now in national militaries, make the argument that including women in these spaces is not maybe the right thing to do. No one was buying that argument for a really long time, right? We had laws that required it, international, national laws that required women's inclusion. That didn't really work. And the argument really became that if you want to do the job well, if you want to be operationally effective, you better include women. It's not that peace is good for women, it's that women are good for peace. And women in these spaces, in these international spaces, started making this argument that women's rights were a security issue. And that was new, because women's rights were always like, oh, that's a health issue, or that's a really private thing, or that's to be dealt with even maybe in an economic space, but not in a security space, right? Security was not a place for women or women's issues per se. And so women in the early 2000s really began advocating that, hey, we're done with the normative argument, right? We're done with the what's required by law argument. We're going to just make the operational effectiveness argument. And they were able to do that. And that's how the Women, Peace, and Security agenda was born. It's very much what I would call an instrumental argument. This is a way in which saying women were a resource, an untapped resource, a value add. And it got the attention. I mean, this isn't new, folks. Everything we talk about in terms of security gets more attention. We say energy security. Oh, we should care about it more. Or food security, right? Or women, peace, and security. All of a sudden, if it's a security issue, it's going to elevate its status and importance. So women were not naive to that. And so what they did in 2000 was they convinced the UN Security Council. So everybody's familiar with the UN Security Council. It's like the central body of the UN. To pass a resolution that said this, that actually specifically talked about women and the role that women were to play in the Security Council and in conflict resolution, in peacekeeping operations. And what's shocking, this happened in 2000, what's shocking is that that was the first time the Security Council had ever considered women specifically. So they had made some mentions about, women as survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, but they never focused on them. And so it wasn't until 2000 that the Security Council said, you know what? If we want to do our job better, because we weren't really doing it very well, we need to include women. And so they passed this landmark resolution in 2000. And it was a pretty radical resolution because it was multifaceted. It talked about women's participation and the protection of women and the role that gender plays in preventing armed conflict. So how do we have less war and not just respond to crises? How can international organizations like the UN facilitate that? So when we think about this resolution, there are 4 pillars. These 4 pillars are what informs policy, what informs NATO, what informs the UN. So the first one is participation. So the resolution, this agenda that I've been talking about, calls for the inclusion of women in decision-making in national, regional, and global institutions. So this is like, hey, look, we're not using all of our assets when we have a peace talk. The only people at the peace talks are the guys with guns, right? You want to bring peace to a community, bring the other 51% of folks in that population, right? The second one was protection. This is one where it was not to say that they were very clear that women and men suffer differently in conflict. So to be very frank and blunt about it, men are more likely to die in conflict and women are more likely to experience sexual or gender-based violence. That's the realities. And so how do we, if those are the protection needs, how would we do things differently if we considered those in equal ways? Prevention was the third pillar. So oftentimes when we're looking to prevent conflicts, community members, particularly women, have their thumb on the needle, right? They know when young men and young women in their communities are amassing weapons somewhere, right? They have a sense of when tensions are rising between different groups of people. And so how do you include civil society organizations, and particularly women's organizations, in the prevention efforts? Because actually it's a lot more effective to prevent a conflict than trying to stop a conflict. It's a lot more cost effective too. And then last but not least was recovery and relief efforts, was the last part of this resolution. This piece called for efforts to ensure that when we were trying to rebuild a community, so whether we are working in Afghanistan to rebuild it, or we're working in Liberia, or we're working in Colombia as an international community, how are we taking the different needs of men and women in society into account in those efforts? So as we disarm and demobilize militaries, that has different implications for men and women. If we think about the prosecution of war crimes, how might we do that differently from a gendered lens? And so these are the 4 pillars of this resolution. This was a really big deal in 2000 because the Security Council had just never talked about these things before. And it really shifted the narrative about how we think about what conflict resolution and conflict prevention look like. So we start with this resolution. We have 1 in 2000. The Security Council, over about 15 years, passes 9 more. So we have now 10 total on a whole range of issues. The second one that we got was on sexual violence and armed conflict, and that was in 2008. And that wasn't surprising because we had quite an emphasis on that after the 90s, where we had video footage coming out of Bosnia and the rape camps that existed there, or the genocide that occurred and the gender-based violence that occurred in Rwanda. All of that led to sort of an awareness about sexual violence and conflict, where all of a sudden, that idea that, well, and then this sounds crass, so my apologies, but for a long time, it was like rape, loot, and pillage. That's part of war. It's inevitable. We just have to expect it and deal with it. And here we are in the 2000s saying, you know what? That kind of violence and conflict is actually not inevitable. It doesn't happen everywhere. It can be prevented, and it can be prosecuted. And that's what we've done in Rwanda, in the former Yugoslavia, and in the International Criminal Court as well. And so the agenda, when I say the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, it's this first resolution in 2000, but then the 9 that followed, because it created a policy architecture or structure that informs so much of how we think about the way international organizations intervene in conflict-affected areas, which we were doing a lot of in the 2000s and the 1990s. We do a little less of it now because the Security Council agrees on nothing now, right? We couldn't agree on Syria or Ukraine, and that's because of the veto power of the permanent 5 members, which I'm happy to talk about, but the role of Russia and China in particular. So the comment was human trafficking and how prevalent it is here in the United States. And one of the things that's become really interesting about the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is that it started off as a resolution that focused on countries that are in active war, right? And how are we going to address women's rights and gender issues in those spaces? But it's expanded, and over 100 countries have now adopted national action plans for women, peace, and security, even if they're not in active war. So the US has had one, and we revised it, actually. So the question was, how does the US compare in terms of human trafficking? I would say, I don't have numbers for you, but it's prevalent, right? And actually, it's something that we work a lot on at the Human Rights Center. And my colleague, actually Myron, I'll give you your next idea for a speaker. My colleague Tony Talbot, who runs Abolition Ohio, which is an anti-trafficking coalition of actors in the state of Ohio, does excellent presentations on human trafficking. So I'm sure he'd be happy to speak with you all. But certainly this is a concern for us here in Ohio. and we're working very hard on it. So 1325, that was the resolution. So here's the deal. When you study the UN or international organizations, you like to use lots of acronyms, right? Because we sound like we know what we're talking about. So we talk about 1325, that was the resolution. And WPS, Women, Peace, and Security, that's that broader agenda. So what does that look like if a country were to implement women, peace, and security? It's a couple of things. And they use these terms at the UN, gender balancing and gender mainstreaming. I would say it's more about just actual men and women. So it's more like sex balancing and mainstreaming. But it's thinking about the ways in which policies and programs are not discriminatory, that they can be gender responsive and family friendly, that they can support the creation of female staffing associations. So one of the things that we saw the US adopt very effectively in Afghanistan were FETs, all-female units in Afghanistan. So these were small military units of all female soldiers, Army, I think they were Army, and they were much more effective in certain spots in Afghanistan, given the gender dynamics in the country and who they could talk to and who they have inroads to, because women in Afghanistan couldn't talk to male soldiers in many, and wouldn't, but women had certain entree. And so we had that kind of implementation even in the United States. We think about, from a gender mainstreaming, a lot of what we see that came out of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda were the opportunities for focal points or gender advisors that would help missions, whether they were peacekeeping missions or political missions, military or political missions, figure out what are the gender dynamics in the country that we're in and how can we use that to actually promote lasting peace and security. How do we design a budget that has a recognition of the different gender needs in a community? And how do we train our international security forces? So when troops are deployed for a peacekeeping mission, they come from national militaries. Some of the biggest donors are Bangladesh and India. They contribute troops. And so they have all different kind of military standards in their countries. And so how would we train them to be aware of gender dynamics in a country, the differences between men and women, and how they might be involved in peacekeeping differently? Okay, so this is the work that Women, Peace, and Security does. It helps us locate women in conflict. Where are they? Where are they not? Are they at the peace table? Are they the predominant number of refugees in a refugee camp needing specific protections? And how do we create opportunities where this other half of the population can participate in conflict resolution and post-conflict reconstruction? It also helps us shape agendas in terms of asking different questions. So when you start asking questions about men and women and gender, it changes the whole discussion, even in the Security Council. It changes the discussion among military units. So one of the most profound conferences that happened in this time frame was when they brought survivors of sexual violence from a refugee camp to speak to military troops that were monitoring that camp and to explain to them where they were most at risk and how they could make those camps safer for women, because otherwise they hadn't had that kind of information. And so a really powerful opportunity there. And then I think what's most interesting to me as like a scholar is that when we start bringing women into the discussion about what constitutes international peace and security, the answers are different, right? Women's experiences in communities, raising families, the work that they do in communities is different. And so when you ask people, what makes you feel secure? What is security to you? What is peace for you? You can imagine that the answers get really different when you include this other 50% of the population. And so for many answers, it moves the discussion from peace is not just the absence of violence, right? Peace is so much more. When we think about it, it's not just negative peace, as Galtong would remind us, but it's positive peace. It's peace in our families, it's peace at our schools, it's peace at our jobs, it's the ability to travel safely in your streets. And so that has a different implication for thinking about international peace and security, a very, very powerful one. So this all sounds really great, doesn't it? I mean, if we just got this right, things would be better. But we didn't. And it's a struggle. I mean, the UN is struggling on many levels, financially and otherwise. But interestingly, NATO's been pretty good at adopting this agenda, so I'll talk about that. But on the whole, war and conflict and the really horrific violence that occurs in those contexts for men and women has not died down, as we know. 2022 was one of the deadliest in terms of battle-related deaths since the early 90s, since the Rwandan genocide, frankly. In 2022, 600 million women, about 15% of women in the world, lived within 50 kilometers of armed conflict, and that's more than double than what it was in the 90s. In 2020, women accounted for 64% of detected victims of trafficking, sexual exploitation, and abuse. And so that's not to say that men and boys are not victims of trafficking. They certainly are. But women are disproportionately affected. We think about the other roles that women play in society that put them at risk. So women and girls around the world spend about 250 million hours per day on water collection, 3 times more than boys. 8% of countries, women do not have equal rights to even confer citizenship from their spouses and their children. 54% of countries, this is remarkable, but 54%, and I checked this again today to see if anything had changed from a year, do not have laws that base the legal definition of rape on the lack of freely given consent. The challenges are immense when it comes to thinking about these issues. Not even in times of just war, right? That's bad enough, but in countries that are experiencing relative peace. But here's what we know, and here's some of the research that is some of mine and then some I've collected from my colleagues that I presented to NATO. And I did this in part to encourage them to continue the path. Because NATO is really, in this moment, our best source of leadership on the women, peace, and security agenda. Because the UN is not in a good place. They have no money, and the Security Council is just at a deadlock between the dynamics between Russia and China and the US. And so if we're gonna innovate and really make a difference, I see NATO as a lead organization on this agenda. So what we know, a couple of things, and some of this data comes from a colleague of mine who actually shares my last name, which is funny. Her name is Valerie Hudson, and I'm Natalie Hudson, so tell me how weird that is. We both study women, peace, and security, but she's out in Utah. And she has this large N collection, so this large data set where she collects all of this, her and her team collect tons of information on women's experiences in different countries. And then she looks at how violent those countries are, on how likely they are to go to war. And if they go to war, is it civil war, is it interstate war, or is it violent insurgencies? And what she finds is when she puts all of those numbers together, and she takes into account education and the economic prosperity of the country, the biggest indicator for whether or not a country is likely to be at war or most likely to be at peace is how women are treated in that country. It scores higher than the economic well-being of that country, than the geopolitical. So sometimes it matters if you're in the Middle East or if you're somewhere else. It matters more than democracy versus autocracy. It matters the most in her research. The greater the size of the gender gap within states, so gender gap measured on all sorts of indicators. Equality under the law, access to education, healthcare, all of it. The greater the gender gap between men and women, the more likely a state is to be involved in both and intrastate war, so both civil war and interstate war. A state's health, level of corruption, and economic growth are also reflective of how women are treated within a state. And so we talked a lot about what this means for NATO's work. So I'm going to go back to the 3 Ps here for a second. Remember we talked about participation, protection, and prevention. So some of the research here, well, this is sort of abysmal, but when you look at women's participation in peace processes, it's pretty low. So on the average, it's women's participation in a peace negotiation, mediation ranges between 3 and 10%. So if you count all the negotiators, all the mediators, all the participants, that's it. However, we do know, even with those low numbers and where we see higher rates of women, there was a study that was done on all the peace processes and peace agreements that were established between 1992 and 2019. And in those, women averaged about 13% of negotiators. And in the ones where they were the highest, the probability of that agreement, that peace agreement, lasting longer than 2 years increased by almost 30%. When we look at some of the highest ones, like there's a couple, 2 or 3 that are really high, it's 35% of those peace agreements lasting 15 years. And so there's a very clear argument to be made about when women are involved, those agreements tend to last longer. They tend to be a bit more sustainable. And I mean, we could get into the methods of this, but this isn't rocket science because you're including the other half of the community's experience of the war and what was it like before the war and how do we rebuild then following the war. And so we see women's participation having that kind of influence. We also see that when we take a gender-sensitive approach, meaning we're asking questions about where are the men, where are the women, where are they not, in communities where states are fragile, right, or where tensions are rising, or where we know terrorists are likely to build or develop hubs of influence. When we ask questions and do prevention work in those spaces, we are more likely to prevent extremist activity. And this is not surprising either because we know that people who are drawn to extreme terrorist behavior are the people who feel excluded. They're the people who don't have jobs, right? They lack education. They lack the ability to influence their governments. And that can be men or women. But who has a pulse on those things? On those exclusions? That's the question, and how do we understand that? And then in the protection space, this is a space I'm currently working in. Gender-based violence has been used as a weapon of war for millennium. We're not just talking about like sexual assault, but intimidation, trafficking, forced marriage, abuse, and the like. Femicide has even been a part of certain wars. When we dive into the research, though, there's been some great studies on protection. It's actually not in every war, and we can learn from the places where this kind of violence doesn't happen, where it does, and how we might deter it. We also have really good research on understanding the ways in which communities heal after and don't heal after sexual and gender-based violence occurred. And so the Women, Peace, and Security agenda has led to much better practices in addressing survivors and their children oftentimes in these contexts, in survivor-centered ways and trauma-informed sorts of ways. So this is sort of interesting. So you have the UN, they came out with the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. Then you have international organizations like NATO and the European Union and the African Union adopting their own Women, Peace, and Security work. And then nation states did that. 130 some countries have national action plans. These are the countries that do really well when it comes to implementing women, peace, and security in their own country and in their foreign policy. So in their militaries and in their foreign policy. So no surprise here, Norway, Finland, Iceland, Denmark, Luxembourg are some of our better performers. And some of our worst performers, this comes out of Georgetown University's research. Also, no surprise, some of the worst places to be a woman in the world: Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, Iraq, and South Sudan. So I would say the US was on a great trajectory, and we came to a screeching halt about a year ago. So in 2011, the US adopted our first national action plan. We said, here's how we're gonna do it. And we did. We focused both on how can we improve addressing sexual assault in the military, and how can we be better in our foreign interventions and promoting women, peace, and security. We even revised that national action plan in 2014. And then in 2017, a bipartisan bill led by Mark Rubio, of all people, was passed, and Trump signed the first law to enact women, peace, and security congressionally. So it wasn't just an executive level national action plan, but we actually passed a law, came to an agreement, and really began implementing. And it was seen, and I've listened to military folks talk about women, peace, and security, and they really see it as a very inexpensive tool to enhance strategic, tactical, and operational effectiveness, right? Because it expands their base, and it allows them to get into partnerships and conversations and to reach people they aren't typically able to reach. And so the strategy of 2017 was to increase women's participation, the protection piece, adjust international programs to improve outcomes for equality, and encourage our partner governments to do the same. And there's a great quote from Mike Waltz. Remember, you know Mike Waltz? He said, "Where women thrive, extremists don't." Where women thrive, extremists don't. The return on investment's clear, and it's not a big investment. Up until 2021, DoD spent about $3 million annually to engage on women, peace, and security. And $3 million, I mean, that's a lot to me, but when you could put it in the grand total of the US military budget, it's pennies. So we were doing really well. And then in November of 25, Secretary Hegseth called it all off, unilaterally. It's a law in Congress that's now been overturned by our Secretary of Defense. What's interesting is he equated it to woke policies, right? So we are all familiar with that. And regardless of how you feel about woke or unwoke policies, actually it's just not that. So we could have a discussion about whether a policy, it's not a DEI policy. In fact, when you look at the law, if you read it, there's nothing about quotas or having a certain number of women. It's not that. It's not that at all. And so it's a very unfortunate turn of events for the United States in particular. And that's why I think the emphasis is to really lean into NATO, to lead in this space, because we're not going to see it here nationally. We're not going to see it at the UN in any meaningful way soon. So some of the things that I talked about with NATO is like, what can they do? What can they do better? And one of the things that I do in my own research is to talk to women-led organizations in conflict-affected countries. And what do they say is needed? And so one of the things that has been really effective in enhancing women's rights and gender equality and focusing on women's participation and better protection and better prevention is if you have what they call women, peace, and security champions. You have to have elite level buy-in, right? So we know this is true in any industry. If you get someone on the top to buy in and say, you know what, this is good for us, that has real implications. And so there's been a lot of good work around women, peace, and security champions and trying to get military officials and leadership across Europe to really advocate from the top. They have mandated gender training for all NATO military personnel, but not all civilian. And so mandating that for civilian and military. They also have pushed NATO to have more regular interactions between NATO officials, NATO parliamentarians, and civil society organizations, understanding what's happening on the ground, and increased resources. Right now, they push for a 0.07% of defense spending, so not even 1% to go to women, peace, and security specifically. Again, I made it a pitch to parliamentarians to say, look, this is your time to lead in this space, to make a difference in this space. You're on a solid trajectory. They revised their Women, Peace, and Security plan in 2024. And so they just need to recommit to some of these principles. There was a lot of nervousness about the US in that context. But material investment, courageous alliances, and concrete actions. What's interesting about Women, Peace, and Security when what the UN faces right now is anything with the word gender in it is being mandated out. So, and that's coming from the US and Russia and China and some Middle Eastern countries because gender is now presumed to have all links to LGBTQ+, right? And so it's a really unfortunate narrowing and misunderstanding of what we actually mean by gender. And so there's a big push for NATO to keep its commitment to even using the word gender equality. I actually worked with a practitioner who's doing a report, and she said, I just wrote this report on gender equality and for a UN agency, and I was told I had to take the word gender out of everything. But it was about making things equal for women and men. So I'm not making this up, I guess is what I'm saying. And then lastly, Member states can prioritize both at the NATO level, but also in their home countries in terms of prioritizing women, peace, and security.